You're still thinking about them. The ones who left, the ones who walked away without explanation, the ones who promised forever and delivered silence. You replay the conversations. You dissect the moments. You search for the exact second where everything changed. And somewhere deep inside you believe that if you had been different, better, more interesting, more valuable, they would have stayed. But what if I told you that their departure wasn't your failure? What if the people who abandoned you didn't take something from you, but instead revealed something essential about your journey? What if Carl Jung was right when he suggested that the most painful losses are actually the universe's way of clearing space for your true self to emerge? This isn't about positive thinking. This isn't about pretending the pain didn't hurt. This is about understanding a psychological truth that most people will never grasp because they're too busy chasing the ghosts of relationships that were never meant to survive. The people who left you did exactly what they were supposed to do, not because you weren't enough, but because they were never yours to keep. And the moment you understand this distinction, everything changes. Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are beneath the masks you wear for others. But here's what most people miss. Individuation requires separation. It demands loss. It needs the uncomfortable truth that not everyone is meant to witness your transformation. Some people are assigned to your life for a season, not a lifetime. They arrive to teach you something, to mirror back a part of yourself you needed to see, and then they leave. Their departure is not punishment, it's curriculum. Think about the last person who abandoned you. Really think about them, not the idealized version you created in your mind during those late-night hours when loneliness feels like drowning. Think about who they actually were. The patterns you ignored, the red flags you painted green because you were more committed to the fantasy than the reality. The ways they showed you exactly who they were, but you kept insisting they would change. You begged them to stay. You twisted yourself into shapes that weren't yours just to keep them interested. You silenced your truth to accommodate their comfort, and still they left. Now ask yourself this. What kind of person were you becoming while trying to keep them? Were you more yourself or less? Were you expanding or shrinking? Were you growing in your truth or hiding from it? The people who abandon you often do so because, on some level, conscious or not, they recognize that you're outgrowing the version of yourself that needed them. And instead of celebrating that evolution, instead of supporting your emergence, they retreat. Because your growth reminds them of their stagnation. Your courage highlights their fear. Your willingness to change exposes their attachment to staying the same. This is the favor, not the leaving itself, but what the leaving makes possible. When someone walks away, they take with them all the energy you were spending on maintaining a connection that required you to be smaller than you are. They remove the obligation to perform. They eliminate the exhausting work of being understood by someone who was never going to truly see you. And in that space, that terrifying, beautiful, empty space, you finally have room to ask the question you've been avoiding. Who am I when I'm not trying to be enough for someone else? Jung believed that we don't become ourselves in isolation, but we also don't become ourselves in relationships that require us to abandon our inner truth. The work of becoming whole demands that we encounter others. Yes, but it also demands that we let go of those who would keep us fragmented. Some people love the broken version of you because it makes them feel needed. Some people prefer you confused because it makes them feel wise. Some people want you dependent because it gives them power. And when you start choosing yourself, when you start remembering your sovereignty, these people don't celebrate, they leave. Let them. This is the beginning of your real life, not the one you perform for approval, not the one you design around someone else's comfort, the one that belongs entirely to you, the one where your choices are yours, where your truth doesn't need permission, where your peace isn't negotiated. The people who left cleared the path. They removed themselves from a journey they weren't equipped to walk, and your job now isn't to convince them to come back. It's to keep walking without them. You've been carrying their absence like evidence of your inadequacy. You point to the empty space where they used to be and say, "See, this proves I'm not enough." But what if that empty space isn't evidence of your lack? What if it's evidence of your evolution? What if the reason they couldn't stay is because you were becoming someone they no longer recognized, someone whose frequency no longer matched theirs, someone whose path diverged from theirs in ways that couldn't be reconciled? I know this is hard to accept because abandonment feels personal, It feels like rejection of your core self. But Jung would ask you to consider this. Were they rejecting your core self? Or were they rejecting the self you were becoming? The self that no longer needed them in the way they needed to be needed. There's a difference. A crucial one. When someone leaves because you're becoming more yourself, that's not abandonment. That's misalignment. And misalignment, while painful, is not a commentary on your worth. It's information about compatibility. Think of it this way. You're a frequency. You're vibrating at a certain level based on your awareness, your healing, your growth, your choices. Every person in your life is also a frequency. When those frequencies match, connection feels effortless. When they don't, connection requires force. It requires performance. It requires you to modulate yourself to match them, or them to modulate themselves to match you. And for a while, you can do this. You can perform. You can pretend. You can meet in the middle. But eventually, if you're truly committed to your own evolution, your frequency shifts. You change. You grow. You heal. And suddenly the performance becomes unbearable. The people who abandon you at this stage aren't villains. They're just operating at a different frequency. They're comfortable where they are. They're not interested in the kind of transformation you're undergoing, and rather than holding you back, rather than demanding you stay at their level, they leave. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes cruelly, sometimes quietly, but always for the same reason: incompatibility with who you're becoming. This is the favor Jung was pointing toward. Not every connection is meant to survive your evil. Some relationships exist to show you who you were. Others exist to challenge you toward who you're becoming. And a rare few exist to witness who you truly are. The people who abandoned you belong to the first category. They showed you who you were at a certain stage. They reflected back patterns you needed to see. They participated in dynamics you needed to understand. And then, when their role was complete, they left. Not because you failed, but because the lesson was over. But here's where most people get stuck. Instead of graduating from the lesson, they repeat Italiano. They find new people who play the same role. They recreate the same dynamic with different faces. They keep trying to get someone to stay who isn't meant to, all while ignoring the real invitation to stop abandoning yourself. Because here's the truth. Underneath the truth, the people who abandoned you were only able to do so because on some level, you had already abandoned yourself. You had already prioritized their presence over your peace. You had already chosen their approval over your authenticity. You had already made yourself smaller to fit into their idea of who you should be. Their leaving didn't create your emptiness. E revi l'italiano. And now you have a choice. You can fill that emptiness with another person who will require the same performance, the same self-betrayal, the same exhausting dance of trying to be enough. Or you can fill it with yourself, your truth, your sovereignty, your essential nature. You can become the one who doesn't leave. You can become the one who stays committed to your own evolution, even when others find it uncomfortable. You can become the one who no longer needs external validation, because you've remembered your internal worth. This is the work. This is the journey Jung was mapping. Not back to the people who left, but forward into the self you've been avoiding. The self that doesn't need anyone to complete it. The self that can hold connection without dependency. The self that loves freely because it no longer fears abandonment. Why? Because it knows the deepest truth. The only abandonment that truly destroys you is the one you inflict on yourself. So let's talk about what happens next. Because understanding that abandonment was a favor is one thing. Living as if it was a favor is another. You can intellectually agree that their leaving cleared space for your growth. But until you actually use that space, until you actually step into the freedom their absence created, nothing changes. You just become someone who knows the right words, but still lives in the old patterns. And Jung was very clear about this. Insight without integration is just spiritual bypassing. Integration means you stop checking their social media, not because you're pretending you don't care, but because you genuinely recognize that their life is no longer your concern. Integration means you stop crafting messages you'll never send. Stop imagining conversations where they finally understand. Stop waiting for them to realize what they lost. Because the truth is, they didn't lose anything. They made a choice, and that choice revealed everything you needed to know about their capacity to meet you where you are. Let that sink in. They didn't lose you. They chose to leave you. And there's a profound difference between those two things. When someone loses something, there's regret. There's searching. There's an attempt to recover what was misplaced. But when someone chooses to leave, they've already decided that whatever you offered wasn't worth staying for. Not because you didn't offer enough, but because they weren't interested in what you were offering. They wanted something different, something you're not, something you were never meant to be. And this is where the favor becomes undeniable, because their leaving saved you from a lifetime of trying to be something you're not. It saved you from the slow death of self-betrayal. It saved you from waking up 10 years from now next to someone who never really knew you because you never really showed them. Their abandonment was an intervention, a forced course correction, a necessary ending that you were too attached to prevent, but that the universe orchestrated anyway. Jung talked about the self with a capital S, the totality of who you are, beyond the ego's limited perception. And he suggested that the self has its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own way of guiding you toward wholeness, even when your ego is desperately clinging to what's familiar. The people who abandoned you, they were removed by yourself, not as punishment, but as protection. Because yourself knows something your ego doesn't. Those people would have kept you small. They would have kept you safe. They would have kept you stuck in a version of yourself that was comfortable for them but suffocating for you. Yourself wants you whole. Yourself wants you integrated. Yourself wants you living at your highest frequency, expressing your deepest truth, embodying your fullest potential. And anyone who requires you to diminish that in order to maintain connection is incompatible with your self's agenda. So the self removes them, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, but always inevitably. Because the drive toward individuation, toward becoming who you truly are, is stronger than any relationship that requires you to be who you're not. This is what you've been mourning, not the actual person who left, but the fantasy of who they could have been if they had chosen differently. The potential relationship you never actually had but kept believing was possible. The version of them that existed only in your imagination. And here's the hard truth. You can't mourn a fantasy forever. At some point, you have to wake up. You have to see what was real. You have to accept that the person you're grieving never existed, and the person who did exist made their choice. Now it's time for you to make yours. Are you going to keep living in the past, replaying what happened, analyzing what went wrong, imagining what could have been different? Or are you going to step into the present, into the space they're leaving created, into the freedom you now have to build a life that doesn't require anyone's permission? This is the choice. This is the moment. This is where you either use the favor or waste it. Using the favor means building yourself back from the truth. Not from who you were when you were with them. Not from who you think you should be to attract someone better. But from who you actually are when no one is watching. Your real preferences. Your real values. Your real boundaries. Your real desires. No performance. No pretending. No people-pleasing. Just you in your most essential form. Deciding what kind of life you actually want to live. And here's what you'll discover. The life you actually want to live looks nothing like the life you were trying to build with them. The person you actually are wants things they would have never understood. The truth you've been hiding is incompatible with the dynamic you were maintaining. You weren't losing yourself in that relationship. You were preventing yourself from ever being found. And their leaving forced you into the most uncomfortable, most necessary, most transformative position possible, being alone with yourself. This is where the real work begins. Not in finding someone new, not in proving you're lovable, not in becoming so impressive that they regret leaving, but in sitting with yourself, in your silence, in your solitude, in your unperformed existence, and asking the questions you've been too distracted to ask. What do I actually believe? What do I actually want? What do I actually need? Not what I was taught to want, not what I think I should want, but what my soul, myself, my essential nature is calling me toward. Jung said that loneliness is not the absence of company, but the absence of self. And you've been lonely for a long time, not because people left, but because you've left yourself. You abandoned your truth to maintain their comfort. You silenced your needs to accommodate theirs. You made yourself optional in your own life so you could be essential in theirs. And when they left anyway, you were left with the wreckage of self-betrayal. Not their betrayal. Yours. But here's the gift hidden in that wreckage. You get to rebuild. And this time you get to build from truth. You get to construct a life where your presence in it is non-negotiable, where your voice matters, where your boundaries are respected, where your evolution is celebrated, where your sovereignty is sacred. And anyone who can't meet you there, anyone who requires you to be less so they can feel like more, doesn't get access. Not because you're bitter, not because you're closed, but because you've finally learned the lesson their abandonment was teaching. Some people are not meant to come with you. This is selective sovereignty. This is the peace Jung was pointing toward. Not the peace of having everyone like you, but the peace of knowing who you are and being unwilling to negotiate it for connection. The people who left couldn't give you that peace. They couldn't even understand it, because peace, real peace, doesn't come from being chosen by someone else. It comes from choosing yourself so completely that other people's choices stop defining your worth. So let them stay gone. Let them live their lives. Let them find whatever it is they're looking for. And you do the same, not in opposition to them, not in competition with them, but in complete indifference to them. Because that chapter in your story is over, and the next chapter, the one you're about to write, doesn't include them. Not as a villain, not as a lesson, not even as a memory you revisit. They're just gone, and you're still here. And that's not a tragedy. That's a beginning. If this resonates, if you're finally ready to stop mourning what left and start building what's next, subscribe. Because there's more truth coming. More uncomfortable, necessary, liberating truth. The kind that changes how you see everything. The kind that Jung spent his life uncovering. The kind that most people avoid because it requires them to stop performing and start being. But you're not most people. You're here. You're listening. You're ready. So let's keep going. Like this video, if you're choosing yourself. Comment below with one thing you're reclaiming now that they're gone. And remember, the people who abandoned you didn't take anything you actually needed. They just made space for you to find it.